"Get out of the car now," barked the officer, his hand resting on his gun. The tension was electric. James Lawson, a tall, clean-shaven black man in his early 40s, sat in the driver's seat of his sleek black sedan, his hands visible on the steering wheel. He was dressed sharply, his tailored navy suit and crisp white shirt a stark contrast to the gravel-strewn roadside. "I'm not resisting." "I'll comply," James said firmly but calmly, his rich voice steady. The officers, both white and visibly agitated, yanked open the car door. One grabbed James' arm while the other unceremoniously shoved him against the vehicle. The chilling sound of handcuffs locking in place echoed in the cool evening air. "This is a misunderstanding," James tried to reason, wincing as the cuffs bit into his wrists. "I am the—" "Save it," one officer interrupted. "We know exactly who you are, another thug up to no good." As James was forced into the back seat of the patrol car, the officers seemed pleased with their work. They were completely unaware they had just arrested the Attorney General of the state. The scene was surreal, like something out of a twisted drama. How did it get to this point? And how could the officers not know who he was? The answer lay in the events of the day leading up to this moment. That morning, James had a packed schedule. Being the Attorney General wasn't just a title, it was a responsibility he took seriously. He had just finished a high-profile press conference addressing reforms to combat racial bias in law enforcement, a cause he was deeply passionate about, having seen firsthand how systemic racism tore families apart. "You're pushing hard, James," his chief aide Rebecca had said as they left the conference. "Do you think this will finally move the needle?" "We have to keep pushing, Rebecca," he replied. "Lives depend on it." James left his office that evening to drive home, opting for some quiet time rather than having his driver take him. He enjoyed these moments alone, the hum of the road giving him space to decompress. Dressed in his work suit, his badge and official identification rested in his inner jacket pocket, a precaution he rarely needed but always carried. As he cruised through a suburban area, James noticed flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. The familiar knot of tension formed in his stomach. Despite his position, or maybe because of it, he knew all too well what interactions with law enforcement could entail for a black man. He pulled over promptly, rolling down his window and placing his hands where they could be seen. Two officers approached, one on each side. "License and registration," the first officer demanded gruffly. He peered into the car with a look James recognized: suspicion. "Of course, officer." James reached slowly for his glove compartment, narrating his movements. "My license is here, and my registration is in this envelope." As James handed over the documents, the second officer spoke into his radio, his tone sharp. "We have a suspicious individual matching a description," he said. "Could be armed." James frowned. "Matching a description? Officer, is there a reason I'm being pulled over?" "Step out of the vehicle." The first officer barked, ignoring the question. James sighed, his patience thinning. "Sir, I don't believe I've done anything to warrant this. My papers are in order, and—" "Out. Now." The officer's hand moved to his holstered weapon, the universal signal that the conversation was over. James exited the car slowly, his tall frame unfolding as he stepped onto the pavement. The officers moved quickly, ordering him to face the vehicle while frisking him roughly. "Sir, I'm James Lawson, the Attorney General," he said as they began patting him down. His voice was calm but firm. The officers exchanged a glance that was equal parts disbelief and mockery. "Yeah, right," one sneered. "Tell it to the judge." They twisted his arms behind his back, snapping the cuffs on with unnecessary force. James winced but didn't resist. He'd learned long ago that compliance often meant survival, though it never guaranteed it. A small crowd began to gather on the sidewalk, phones in hand, recording the unfolding scene. James spotted the faces of a few onlookers. Some looked sympathetic, others skeptical. The officers paid no mind as they hustled him into their squad car, their expressions triumphant. As the door slammed shut, James felt an anger he hadn't felt in years bubbling beneath his professional demeanor. He had faced discrimination before, but this was a new level. Back in the patrol car, the officers were high-fiving. "But he thought that suit would save him," one said, chuckling. James sat silently, his mind racing. He had to play this smart. Every action from this point forward would define not just his fate but the message this incident would send to others. But first, he needed to get the officers to check his identification. "Officers," he began, his voice measured. I believe you'll find that my credentials are in my jacket pocket. I'm not asking you to take my word for it, just verify it. But the officers ignored him. We've got ourselves a big one said to the other. They'll love this back at the precinct. James leaned back, his jaw tightening. He knew this wouldn't end with a simple conversation. His thoughts swirled with possible outcomes, each one more troubling than the last. And then, the police radio crackled. A dispatcher's voice filled the car. Be advised, vehicle matches description from reported carjacking. Suspect may be armed and dangerous. One of the officers smirked. Guess you're not so innocent after all, huh? James's heart sank. He realized the misunderstanding was worse than he thought. He wasn't just another traffic stop. They genuinely believed he was involved in a crime. The patrol car started moving, and James glanced out the window at the bystanders still recording. He couldn't shake the thought, how did it come to this? But he also knew one thing for certain, the truth was about to come out, and when it did, it wouldn't be him who was left answering questions. The squad car pulled into the police station, and James took a deep breath, bracing himself for what was coming next. The squad car came to an abrupt halt outside the station. The officers yanked open the door, pulling James out with unnecessary force. He stumbled but quickly regained his balance, keeping his composure despite the humiliation. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights flickered, casting a sterile glow on the rows of desks and officers milling about. James's entrance caused a ripple of interest. A few heads turned, some indifferent, others curious. The arresting officers marched him toward a desk where a burly sergeant sat sipping coffee and flipping through paperwork. Got one for you, Sarge, one officer said, pushing James forward. Possible carjacking suspect. Matches the description. The sergeant raised an eyebrow, glancing up. And this guy fought you? Not exactly, the officer admitted, looking almost disappointed. But he was acting suspicious. James finally spoke, his tone calm but commanding. Sergeant, I insist you check my identification. It's in my jacket pocket. This is a mistake. The sergeant frowned, leaning back in his chair. Who are you supposed to be? I'm James Lawson, James said evenly. The Attorney General of this state. My credentials are in my pocket. You'll find them if you just look. The room fell momentarily silent. A younger officer seated nearby snorted. Attorney General? That's a new one. The sergeant, skeptical but slightly curious, motioned to the arresting officers. Check his pocket. Let's see what kind of credentials he's carrying. One of the officers hesitated, then grudgingly reached into James's inner jacket pocket. He pulled out a sleek leather wallet and flipped it open. His face paled instantly as he stared at the embossed gold lettering and official seal. He handed it to the sergeant without a word. The sergeant studied the identification, his eyes narrowing. The room grew quieter as other officers began to take notice. Holy! This says he's the Attorney General. James didn't flinch. That's because I am. The sergeant's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at the arresting officers, his face a mix of disbelief and irritation. You didn't verify this before bringing him in? He fit the description, stammered one of the officers, his earlier bravado gone. We thought. You thought wrong, the sergeant snapped, his voice cutting through the room. You just brought in the state attorney general in cuffs without checking his ID? Are you insane? James felt a flicker of satisfaction at the sergeant's reaction, but it was quickly overshadowed by the sting of what had just happened. He could see the growing embarrassment on the officers' faces, but it wasn't enough. You humiliated me on the side of the road, James said, his voice rising just enough to command attention. You ignored my words, disregarded my credentials, and assumed I was guilty because of the color of my skin. Now tell me, how do you plan to fix this? The sergeant turned back to James, his expression shifting to one of awkward respect. Mr. Lawson, I sincerely apologize. This is a huge mistake. A mistake. James shot back. That's what you call it? Let me tell you something. I've spent years fighting for justice. Justice for people who don't have the privilege of a title to protect them. What happened tonight wasn't just a mistake. It's a symptom of a bigger problem, one I've been working to address in my role. And tonight, I became another example of it. The sergeant looked at the officers. Take those cuffs off. Now. They fumbled to remove the cuffs, their hands trembling. James rubbed his wrists, the red marks a stark reminder of what had just transpired. I expect to leave here immediately, James said, his tone sharp. But don't think this ends here. I want the names of the officers who arrested me, and I want a formal apology. Absolutely, the sergeant said quickly. We'll provide a full report. And again, I'm so sorry, Mr. Lawson. James didn't respond. He turned to leave, but stopped as he reached the door. He turned back, his eyes locking onto the arresting officers. Let me make something clear. You might have thought you were doing your job, but tonight, you revealed exactly why my job matters. He walked out of the station, his head held high, but the anger simmered beneath the surface. Outside, the cool night air hit him, offering little relief. Reporters had already begun to gather, tipped off by the spectacle on the roadside. Cameras flashed as James emerged, and microphones were thrust toward him. Mr. Lawson, can you comment on your arrest? One reporter called out. Is it true you were mistaken for a criminal? James paused, his mind racing. He knew whatever he said next would dominate headlines. He took a deep breath before speaking. I was wrongfully detained by officers who made an assumption based on my appearance, not my actions, he said firmly. This is exactly the type of injustice I've been fighting against. Tonight, I experienced it firsthand. But I assure you, this isn't the end of the story. The reporters clamored for more, but James raised a hand, signaling he was done speaking. He stepped into a black SUV waiting at the curb, driven by Rebecca. She looked at him, her face etched with concern. Are you okay? She asked softly as he slid into the passenger seat. James leaned back, exhaling slowly. Physically, yes. But this isn't over, Rebecca. Not by a long shot. As they drove off, James's phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages. News of the incident was spreading like wildfire. He knew the coming days would be a whirlwind, but he was ready. This was more than personal, it was a battle for accountability and change. Back at his home, James sat in his study, replaying the events of the night in his mind. His anger hadn't subsided, but it was now tempered with resolve. He picked up his phone and began making calls, starting with his legal team. This wasn't just about his experience, it was about sending a message to everyone who had ever been unjustly targeted. And James Lawson wasn't about to let this moment pass without taking action. But just as he was outlining his next steps, his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a colleague or a reporter. The screen displayed an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. This is James Lawson. The voice on the other end was shaky. Mr. Lawson, this is Officer Bradley. I was one of the officers who arrested you tonight. I need to talk to you. Please. It's important. James's eyes narrowed. Why are you calling me? Because, there's more to this than you know, the officer whispered. I think we were set up. James gripped the phone tighter, his heart pounding. What do you mean, set up? The line went silent for a moment, then Bradley's voice returned, lower and more urgent. I can't talk on the phone. Can we meet? Please. You need to hear this. James glanced at the clock, his mind racing. The night wasn't over yet, and something told him this was only the beginning. James sat frozen, the weight of Officer Bradley's words sinking in. Set up? The idea seemed preposterous, but something in Bradley's tone suggested he was terrified. Of what, James couldn't yet tell. Where do you want to meet? James asked, his voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline. There was a pause on the other end, then Bradley replied, There's a diner on 5th and Main, open all night. Meet me there in 30 minutes. I'll be in the back corner booth. Fine, James said, before hanging up. He stared at his phone, his mind spinning with questions. Was this some desperate attempt by the officer to cover his tracks? Or was there really a larger plot at play? James stood and grabbed his coat, his movements deliberate. He didn't have time to inform anyone on his team. This felt too sensitive, too immediate. But he did slip his phone into his pocket and activate the voice recorder app. If Bradley was about to say something incriminating, James wanted every word documented. The drive to the diner felt longer than it was. The streets were quiet, the city asleep, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath its surface. James parked his car and walked inside, the smell of coffee and frying bacon hitting him immediately. A few patrons lingered in booths, but the place was mostly empty. He spotted Bradley in the back, hunched over a mug of coffee, his face pale and lined with worry. James approached, his shoes clicking softly against the tiled floor. As he slid into the booth across from Bradley, The officer looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "You actually came," Bradley said, his voice hoarse. "You didn't give me much of a choice," James replied, keeping his tone neutral. "What do you need to tell me?" Bradley glanced around nervously, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his mug. I didn't know it was you at first," he began, his words tumbling out. "But when I did, I tried to say something. Officer Miller shut me down." James leaned forward slightly. "And why would Miller do that?" Bradley's hands tightened around the mug. "Because this wasn't random. You were targeted." James's eyes narrowed. "Targeted? For what reason?" Bradley swallowed hard. "There's this group. Some of the guys in the department, Miller included, they've been part of it for years. They keep it quiet, but I've heard enough to know it's bad. They think people like you are a threat." "People like me," James repeated, his voice sharp. "You mean black men?" Bradley nodded, shame flickering across his face. "Yeah. And not just that. You've been too vocal, too high-profile. The reforms you're pushing? They don't like it. I overheard Miller talking last week. He said you needed to be taught a lesson. When the dispatcher called about a car matching your description, he saw his chance." James sat back, his jaw tight. The pieces were starting to come together, and they painted a chilling picture. "So you're saying this was deliberate? Miller knew it was me and arrested me anyway." Bradley nodded again, his eyes darting around the diner. "Yes. And there's more. I think they wanted it to escalate. That's why Miller was so aggressive. He wanted you to resist, to give him an excuse." James's stomach churned. If he had reacted differently, raised his voice, made a sudden move, this could have ended far worse. "Why are you telling me this now?" James asked, his voice hard. "You didn't seem too concerned when you were putting handcuffs on me." Bradley flinched. I didn't know how far it would go. I thought it was just a routine stop at first. But after we got to the station, and I saw your ID, I realized how deep this goes. I couldn't stay silent. Not anymore." James studied the man across from him. Bradley looked genuinely rattled, but James couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this. "If what you're saying is true, then Miller and his group are a danger to more than just me. Why haven't you reported this?" Bradley shook his head. "You don't understand. These guys have connections. They'll ruin me if I go against them. Or worse." James's jaw clenched. He hated the idea of letting fear dictate action, but he also understood it. "You realize that by telling me this, you've already taken a stand. There's no going back." Bradley's shoulders slumped. "I know. But I couldn't live with myself if I stayed quiet. You have power, Mr. Lawson. You can do something about this." James sat in silence for a moment, weighing his next move. If Bradley's claims were true, this was more than an individual act of racism. It was part of a coordinated effort to undermine him and his work. And that meant this wasn't just his fight. "I'll need evidence," James said finally. "Something concrete to back up your claims." Bradley hesitated, then pulled a small flash drive from his pocket. "I've been collecting what I can, recordings, emails, notes. It's not much, but it's a start." James took the flash drive, feeling its weight in his hand. "If what's on here is credible, it could be the beginning of something big. But you'll need to testify." Bradley's face paled further. I don't know if I can do that." "You'll have to," James said firmly. "If you're serious about making this right, you'll need to stand by your words." Bradley nodded reluctantly, his fear palpable. "Okay. I'll do it." As James stood to leave, he paused. "You've taken a risk coming to me, Officer Bradley. I won't forget that. But if you're lying, or if this is some kind of trap—" "It's not," Bradley interrupted, his voice desperate. "I swear it's not." James nodded once and walked out of the diner, the flash drive clenched tightly in his hand. The cool night air did little to calm the fire burning inside him. This was bigger than he'd imagined, and he was now more determined than ever to expose the truth. But as he reached his car, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. It was Rebecca. "James," she said when he answered, her voice urgent. "Are you safe?" "I'm fine," he replied. "Why?" "Because there's a breaking story on the news. Someone leaked the body cam footage of your arrest." James froze. "Body cam footage?" "Yes," Rebecca said. "And it's bad, James. They edited it to make it look like you were resisting. The media's running with it. James's heart pounded as he climbed into his car. If the footage had been manipulated, it was part of the same plot Bradley had warned him about. His enemies weren't just trying to discredit him, they were trying to destroy him. And now, the battle had gone public. James gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing as Rebecca's words echoed in his ears. Edited body cam footage? He had barely left the diner, and already the situation was spiraling out of control. This was no coincidence, it was calculated. "I'll be at my office in 10 minutes, James said into the phone, his voice tense. "Get the team together. We need to get ahead of this." "You got it," Rebecca replied, her tone steady but concerned. "And James, be careful." James hung up, his foot pressing harder on the gas. The streets blurred past as he made his way downtown. His office, a sleek building nestled in the heart of the city, was brightly lit even at this late hour. His staff was already gathering inside, faces grim as they watched the news unfold on the large TV in the conference room. James entered, the air heavy with tension. Rebecca was at the head of the table, flipping through her phone, while his communications director, Sheila, stood frozen, staring at the screen. "It's all over the networks," Sheila said as James walked in. "They're calling it a major controversy. But look at this." Sheila hit play on the footage, and James's stomach churned. The video, taken from a body cam perspective, showed his arrest, but key moments were missing. The calm compliance he'd shown was replaced with jerky cuts, creating the illusion of defiance. His voice was distorted, making his words sound aggressive. "This is doctored," James said, his voice cold. "Absolutely," Sheila agreed. "The audio glitches and abrupt edits are obvious. But the public doesn't know that. Right now, social media is eating it up." Rebecca chimed in. "We need to release a statement immediately. If we wait, the narrative will cement." James nodded. "We'll address the footage, but we also need to hit back harder. I have a flash drive here," he said, holding it up. "It contains evidence of corruption within the department, including a plot to target me." Rebecca's eyes widened. "Where did you get that?" "An officer involved in my arrest, Bradley, came forward," James replied. "He claims there's a group inside the department working against me and my reforms. This footage is part of their plan." Sheila looked uneasy. "That's explosive, James. But if we go public with it, we need to be airtight. Do we know what's on the drive?" "Not yet," James admitted. "But we're about to find out." He handed the flash drive to his tech specialist, Connor, who immediately plugged it into his laptop. The room fell silent as Connor's fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating through the files. "There's a lot here," Connor muttered. "Emails, recorded conversations, and, wow, a file labeled Target List." "Open it," James said. Connor clicked on the file, and a document appeared, listing names, photos, and notes. James's picture was at the top, with phrases like high priority, discredit, and anti-reform agitator. The room erupted in gasps. "This isn't just targeting you," Connor said, scrolling down. "There are other reform advocates, journalists, and community leaders on this list. It's a hit list for anyone pushing back against systemic corruption." James's jaw tightened. "This isn't just an attack on me. It's an attack on justice itself." Rebecca leaned forward. "This changes everything. If we release this, it could blow their entire operation wide open. But we need to verify everything first," Sheila cautioned. "If we get one detail wrong, it'll backfire, and they'll spin it against us." James nodded. "Agreed. Connor, I want every file authenticated. Work through the night if you have to. Sheila, draft a preliminary statement addressing the doctored footage. We'll release it first thing in the morning, once we've confirmed the evidence." "What about the officer who gave you this?" Rebecca asked. "Is he safe?" James paused. He hadn't thought about Bradley's safety in the chaos of the last hour. If this group was as dangerous as it seemed, Bradley could be a target now. "I'll call him," James said. "If he's in danger, we need to protect him." He stepped out of the room and dialed Bradley's number. It rang twice before the officer picked up, his voice hushed. "Mr. Lawson?" Bradley sounded on edge. "Where are you?" James asked. "Are you safe?" "I don't know," Bradley admitted. "After I left the diner, I noticed a car following me. I've been driving around trying to lose them." James's stomach sank. Listen to me carefully. Go to the nearest precinct, not the one you work at, and tell them you need protection. Use my name if you have to. I can't, Bradley said, panic creeping into his voice. What if they're in on it? James hesitated. Bradley had a point. If this conspiracy ran deep, trusting any precinct could be a risk. Fine, James said. Head to my office. I'll have someone meet you in the parking garage and escort you inside. Stay on the line until you get here. Okay, Bradley agreed, his voice shaking. James ended the call and immediately instructed Rebecca to send security to the garage. As he re-entered the conference room, Sheila handed him a draft statement addressing the footage. It was concise and firm, calling out the video's manipulations while emphasizing James's compliance during the arrest. This is solid, James said. Release it now. We need to start regaining control of the narrative. Sheila nodded and left to handle the release. Meanwhile, Connor continued sifting through the files, occasionally muttering updates. The tension in the room was palpable. Half an hour later, Bradley arrived, visibly shaken. Rebecca led him into the conference room, and he sank into a chair, his hands trembling. They're not going to stop, Bradley said, his voice barely above a whisper. If they find out I talked to you. They won't, James said firmly. We'll protect you. But I need you to be honest with me. Is there anyone else in the department who might come forward? Bradley shook his head. Most of them are either involved or too scared. I'm all you've got. James nodded, appreciating Bradley's candor. Then we'll make it count. But just as he was about to say more, Connor's voice cut through the room. James, you need to see this. Everyone gathered around Connor's laptop as he played a recording labeled Miller_conversation. The audio crackled, then Miller's voice came through, clear and unmistakable. Lawson's a problem. He's making it too hard to keep things quiet. We need to take him down before he takes us down. Another voice replied, and if he fights back? Miller laughed. Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance. The recording ended, leaving a heavy silence in the room. This is it, Connor said. Proof of intent. Proof of conspiracy. James's eyes burned with determination. It's not just proof. It's the beginning of the end for them. Before anyone could respond, James's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from an unknown number. It read, "Drop this now, or you'll regret it." James showed the message to Rebecca. Looks like they know we're onto them. Rebecca frowned. What's the plan? James stared at the screen, the weight of the fight ahead pressing down on him. But he wasn't backing down. The plan, he said, his voice steely, is to expose every last one of them. The room was silent as James stared at the message on his phone. The threat wasn't unexpected, but it still hit like a gut punch. It wasn't just about him anymore. Everyone involved, Bradley, his team, and the people listed in the files, was now in danger. Rebecca broke the silence. We need to alert law enforcement outside of the city. If this group has infiltrated local precincts, we can't trust anyone here. James nodded. I'll contact the FBI. This conspiracy isn't just a local issue, it's systemic. But we need to move fast. If they're threatening me directly, they're desperate. That makes them dangerous. Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his chair. What if they come after my family? I have a wife and kids. I didn't think. They'll be protected, James interrupted, his tone firm. We'll ensure they're safe. But we need your cooperation to bring this to light. Bradley nodded reluctantly, his face pale. Okay. I'll do whatever you need. James turned to Connor. How much of the evidence can we verify now? Connor tapped furiously on his keyboard. Most of the emails and recordings check out. I've cross-referenced timestamps, IP addresses, and even voices in the audio files. This is rock solid. But there's one file I haven't cracked yet. It's encrypted. How long will it take? James asked. Connor shrugged. Could be hours, could be days. Depends on the encryption level. But if it's locked up this tight, it's probably important. Prioritize it, James said. We'll need every piece of this puzzle. Rebecca pulled James aside, lowering her voice. Are you sure about involving the FBI? If this leaks before we're ready, it could compromise everything. James met her gaze. We don't have a choice. This is bigger than us, Rebecca. We need resources and reach that only they can provide. Rebecca hesitated, then nodded. I'll make the call. While Rebecca stepped out to contact the FBI, James refocused on Bradley. I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there anyone in your department who isn't involved in this conspiracy? Someone who might support our case? Bradley thought for a moment, then said, Lieutenant Harris. She's one of the good ones. I don't think she's part of this. She's always stood up for what's right, even when it wasn't popular. Can you reach her? James asked. I think so, Bradley said. But if they're watching me, it could be risky. James considered this. We'll find a secure way to contact her. If she's trustworthy, she could be an ally on the inside. Just then, Rebecca re-entered the room, her expression tense. The FBI's on board. They're sending agents first thing in the morning. But they need us to secure Bradley and the files until then. James nodded. Understood. We'll lock everything down. No one leaves this building without clearance. As the team set to work securing their evidence and preparing for the FBI's arrival, James felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He knew the stakes were high, but now they were higher than ever. If even one piece of this operation failed, the consequences could be catastrophic. Hours later, as dawn began to break, Connor let out a triumphant shout. I cracked the encryption. The room crowded around him as he opened the file. Inside were detailed plans, maps, surveillance photos, and documents outlining coordinated efforts to target key individuals, including James. But what caught James's attention was a list of dates and locations. These look like meeting schedules, Connor said, pointing to the entries. If we decode the abbreviations, we might find out where they're gathering next. James leaned in, his eyes scanning the list. This could be our chance to catch them in the act. If we can get surveillance on their next meeting, we'll have undeniable proof. Rebecca frowned. It's risky. If they suspect we're onto them, they might scatter. Or worse, they could retaliate. James nodded grimly. It's a risk we have to take. But we'll coordinate with the FBI. With their resources, we can monitor the meeting without tipping them off. Bradley, who had been sitting silently, spoke up. There's one more thing you should know. Miller, he's not just some rogue cop. He's connected to people higher up. I've heard him talking about a backer, someone funding their operations. If we don't find out who that is, taking down Miller won't stop this. James's jaw tightened. This revelation added another layer to an already tangled web. Did he ever mention a name? Bradley shook his head. No, but he always seemed nervous when he talked about it. Like this person was someone he feared. James exhaled slowly, the weight of the fight ahead bearing down on him. Then we'll dig until we find out who it is. No matter how high this goes, we're bringing it down. Later that morning, the FBI agents arrived, their presence bringing a mix of relief and tension. They reviewed the evidence, impressed by the work James's team had done. As James briefed them on the situation, one of the lead agents, Special Agent Thompson, offered a grim smile. You've got enough here to make waves, Thompson said. But if this conspiracy is as deep as you think, it's going to get messy. Are you ready for that? James met his gaze without flinching. I've been ready for years. Let's do this. As the agents prepared to coordinate surveillance on the group's next meeting, a sense of purpose settled over the room. The pieces were finally coming together, and for the first time, James felt like they were on the offensive. But just as hope began to flicker, Rebecca's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her face turning pale. James, she said, her voice trembling. There's been an incident. Bradley's house. It's been set on fire. The room fell silent, the air thick with shock. James's heart sank as Rebecca continued. His family made it out, she added quickly. But the message is clear. They're coming after everyone. James clenched his fists, his anger boiling over. Then it's time we hit back harder. No more waiting. No more playing defense. It's time to bring them down. The room buzzed with urgency as James issued orders. Bradley sat pale and shaken, his hands trembling on the table. Though his family had survived the arson attack, the reality of the danger he had brought upon them was crushing him. We need to secure Bradley's family immediately, James said, his voice firm. Agent Thompson, can the FBI place them under protection? Thompson nodded. We can move them to a safe house, but we'll need their cooperation. Bradley's voice was barely above a whisper. They'll do whatever it takes to be safe. Please, just protect them. James turned to Rebecca. Coordinate with Thompson and make it happen. I don't want any more close calls. Rebecca nodded and stepped out to make the arrangements. Meanwhile, James refocused on the evidence and the group's next planned meeting. The newly decrypted files revealed a gathering scheduled for that very night, at a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was a risky lead, but it was their best shot at catching the conspirators in the act. This is our chance, James said, pointing at the location on a digital map displayed on the screen. If we can get surveillance on that meeting, we'll have undeniable proof of their involvement. Agent Thompson leaned in, studying the map. We'll need to be discreet. If they suspect we're watching, they'll scatter and take their operations underground. Connor chimed in. I can set up remote cameras and audio devices. We'll need someone to get close enough to plant them, though. I'll go, Bradley said suddenly, his voice shaky but resolute. I know Miller's patterns. I can slip in and out without being noticed. James frowned. It's too dangerous. If they recognize you, they won't hesitate to retaliate. Bradley's gaze was determined. They already tried to kill my family, Mr. Lawson. I need to do this. For them. For everyone they've hurt. James considered this for a moment before nodding. Fine. But you're not going in alone. You'll work with the FBI, and you'll be fully briefed on the plan. As the team finalized the operation, tension hung heavy in the air. By late afternoon, Bradley and 2 FBI agents were equipped with hidden cameras, audio bugs, and GPS trackers. The plan was simple but dangerous. Get in, plant the devices, and get out before the meeting began. James watched from the command center set up in his office as live feeds streamed in from the surveillance equipment. The warehouse was dimly lit, its exterior surrounded by rusting fences and overgrown weeds. It looked abandoned, but the cars parked nearby told a different story. Bradley's approaching the perimeter, one of the agents reported. We've got visual. The screen showed Bradley crouched low as he moved toward the building's side entrance. His hands shook as he worked to attach a small camera to a corner of the fence. James could see the strain on his face, but Bradley pressed on. Minutes felt like hours as Bradley and the agents planted the devices. Inside the warehouse, voices began to echo, deep, commanding tones that sent a chill through the room. They're arriving, Connor whispered. We're running out of time. Bradley, move out, Thompson said into the comms. You've done enough. But just as Bradley began retreating, a figure stepped into view. It was Miller. James's breath caught in his throat as Miller scanned the area, his sharp eyes sweeping over the shadows. He paused, tilting his head as if sensing something was off. Stay calm, Thompson said, his voice low. Don't move unless you're spotted. Bradley froze, his back pressed against a wall. The camera feed showed Miller's silhouette growing larger as he approached. For a terrifying moment, it seemed he might walk right into Bradley's hiding spot. But a voice from inside the warehouse called out. Miller. Get in here, we're starting. Miller hesitated, then turned and walked back into the building. Bradley exhaled shakily, his hand gripping the corner of the wall for support. Bradley, pull back now, Thompson ordered. That's an order. This time, Bradley didn't argue. He retreated quickly, his movements swift and precise. Moments later, he and the agents were back in their vehicle, speeding away from the scene. Back at the command center, the tension broke as the team reviewed the live feed from the planted devices. The cameras and microphones captured the conspirators in chilling clarity. Miller stood at the center of the room, flanked by several other officers and 2 men in suits. We've had a setback, Miller said, his voice grim. Lawson's on to us. And that coward Bradley is probably running his mouth. The men muttered angrily, but one of the suited figures raised a hand, silencing them. It doesn't matter. Lawson might think he's ahead, but he doesn't know the full extent of our operation. We'll deal with him, just like we've dealt with everyone else. James's eyes narrowed. Who is that? He asked, pointing to the man on the screen. Thompson leaned closer. That's Alexander Grayson. He's a lobbyist with deep ties to the police unions. If he's involved, this goes higher than we thought. The group on the screen continued their discussion, laying out plans to escalate their efforts. It was clear they weren't just targeting James. They were targeting anyone who challenged their power. This is more than corruption, James said, his voice low. This is organized crime masquerading as law enforcement. Rebecca nodded. We need to release this footage, James. The public has to see what's really happening. James hesitated. Not yet. We need to build a case strong enough to withstand their counterattacks. If we rush this, they'll spin it against us. But we don't have much time, Connor pointed out. If they realize we've been watching, they'll scatter. We'll act soon, James said, his tone resolute. But when we do, it'll be decisive. As the meeting on the screen continued, Miller made a chilling statement. We'll make our next move tomorrow night. Lawson won't see it coming. James clenched his fists. Whatever they were planning, it was clear they intended to strike hard, and soon. The room fell silent as the weight of the situation settled over them. The next 24 hours would be critical. They had to move fast, outsmart their enemies, and expose the truth before it was too late. But James knew one thing for certain: no matter how dangerous the fight became, he wouldn't back down. This was bigger than him, and he was prepared to see it through to the end. James stood before his team, the urgency of their mission etched into his face. The room buzzed with tension as they reviewed the footage from the conspirators' meeting. Every second revealed more damning evidence, but it also raised the stakes. The mention of a planned move against him the next night loomed like a storm cloud. Agent Thompson broke the silence. We need to act fast. If they're planning something tomorrow, we can't sit on this evidence much longer. We need to go public. James shook his head. Not yet. We still don't have the full picture. What if their plan isn't just about me? What if it's bigger than that? Rebecca stepped forward. James, they're targeting you specifically. They've already tried to discredit you, intimidate you, and now they're threatening direct action. If we wait too long, they'll gain the upper hand. I understand that, James said, his voice steady but firm. But I need to be sure we're hitting them where it hurts. If we release this footage prematurely, they'll claim it's doctored and spin the narrative against us. We need more, something that leaves no room for doubt. Connor tapped on his laptop, pulling up additional files from the encrypted folder. We might already have what we need. These documents mention financial transactions, fake charity accounts, and what looks like a slush fund tied to Grayson's name. Thompson leaned in, his eyes scanning the data. If we can trace that money back to the conspirators, it's game over. But financial investigations take time, and we're running out of it. James nodded, his mind racing. We don't need to trace all the money tonight. We just need enough to tie Grayson to Miller and his crew. If we can do that, we'll have a solid foundation to expose the rest. Rebecca crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. And what about their plan tomorrow? Are we just going to wait and see what they do? No, James said firmly. We'll be ready. But we need to control the narrative. If we're too reactive, they'll spin this against us. We need to stay ahead. As night fell, the team worked tirelessly. Connor dove into the financial records, cross-referencing names, accounts, and transactions. Rebecca coordinated with the FBI, ensuring Bradley's family was secure and gathering additional resources. Meanwhile, James prepared a public statement, anticipating the moment they would finally expose the conspiracy. By midnight, Connor had made a breakthrough. I've got it, he announced, his voice cutting through the room. There's a payment from one of Grayson's shell companies to an account registered to Miller. It's dated 2 days before your arrest, James. The room fell silent as the significance of the discovery sank in. This wasn't just a rogue officer acting on personal bias. This was a coordinated effort funded by powerful backers. How much was the payment? James asked. $25,000, Connor replied. Labeled as consulting fees. But Miller doesn't consult, he enforces. Thompson's eyes narrowed. This is the smoking gun we needed. Grayson's involvement ties this conspiracy to a larger network of corruption. With this, we can bring in federal charges. James exhaled, a mix of relief and determination washing over him. Then it's time to act. We'll release the footage and this financial link together. They won't be able to deny it. Rebecca glanced at the clock. If we're going public, we need to do it strategically. Morning news cycles are best for maximum impact. That gives us a few hours to prepare. James nodded. Let's finalize everything. Tomorrow, we make our move. Morning came quickly, and with it, the weight of what was to come. James stood in front of the camera in his office, the room filled with a quiet intensity. His team watched as he prepared to address the nation. This is bigger than me, James said to Rebecca, who stood just off camera. It's about everyone who's been targeted, silenced, or hurt by this system. They need to know they're not alone. Rebecca nodded, her expression resolute. Then show them. The recording began, and James spoke with the conviction of a man who had endured injustice but refused to be defeated. "My name is James Lawson, and I am the Attorney General of this state," he began. "Last night, my team uncovered undeniable evidence of a conspiracy within our law enforcement system. A conspiracy designed to target and discredit individuals fighting for justice and equality." He went on to outline the events of his arrest, the doctored footage, and the subsequent revelations about Miller, Grayson, and their network. He presented the evidence, the recordings, the financial transactions, and the list of names targeted by the group. "This is not just about me," James said, his voice rising with passion. "This is about a system that has been corrupted from within. It's about every person who has been silenced, oppressed, or harmed by those sworn to protect them. Today, we take a stand against that corruption. And we won't stop until justice is served." The recording ended, and within minutes, it was uploaded to every major platform. The footage, paired with the evidence, spread like wildfire. News anchors dissected the revelations, social media exploded with outrage, and public figures began calling for accountability. But as the world reacted, James knew the fight was far from over. The conspirators wouldn't go down quietly, and their plan for that night was still in motion. That evening, James received a call from Agent Thompson. "We've got intel on their next move," Thompson said. "They're planning a coordinated raid on a community center you've supported, a place where your reforms are being implemented." James's heart sank. The community center was a lifeline for marginalized families, offering legal aid, job training, and counseling. It was everything the conspirators hated. "We have to stop them," James said. "What's their plan?" "They're framing it as a drug bust," Thompson explained. "But the goal is to discredit you by tying your name to illegal activity. They've planted evidence to justify the raid." James's jaw tightened. "How soon?" "An hour," Thompson replied. "We've already alerted local allies and FBI teams are en route. But we'll need your help to expose this in real time." James glanced at Rebecca and the rest of his team. "Then let's make sure they can't get away with it." The countdown began, the team mobilizing to intercept the raid. As James prepared to confront the conspirators directly, he knew the night would test everything he stood for. The fight wasn't just about his reputation. It was about protecting the people who believed in him and ensuring the truth prevailed. The hour ticked closer, and James steeled himself for the battle ahead. The conspirators had underestimated him once. This time, he would make sure they regretted it. The clock ticked mercilessly as James and his team raced against time. The FBI was deploying agents to the community center, but James knew they needed more than just a physical presence. They needed to expose the conspirators' plot in real time, to ensure the truth couldn't be buried under fabricated charges. Connor hunched over his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "I'm hacking into their communications system. If we can intercept their radio chatter, we'll have proof of their plans as it unfolds." Rebecca paced behind him. "What about the planted evidence? If they find it and claim it's legitimate, it could still ruin the community center's reputation." James leaned over the table, his mind racing. "We need to prove that evidence was planted before they can make it public. Do we have access to any surveillance at the center?" "I'm on it," Connor replied. He brought up a feed from the center's security cameras. The footage from earlier today might show who planted it. As Connor rewound the footage, James's phone buzzed. It was Agent Thompson. "We're in position," Thompson said. "Their SWAT team is moving in. We've got agents ready to intervene, but we need that evidence of the plant." "We're working on it," James assured him. "Keep them at bay as long as you can." Connor suddenly froze. "Got it." He pointed to the screen, which showed 2 uniformed officers entering the community center earlier that day, carrying a duffel bag. They moved to a storage room, looked around briefly, and then left without the bag. James's stomach twisted. "That's it. Can you enhance the footage to identify them?" Connor nodded, zooming in on their faces. "Facial recognition is running. Give me a minute." "Make it quick," Rebecca said, her voice tense. As the seconds dragged on, the radio in the room crackled to life. Connor had successfully tapped into the conspirators' communications. "This is Unit Bravo," a gruff voice said. "We're approaching the target. Evidence is secure. Once we breach, move to recover and call it in." "Understood," Another voice replied. Lawson's reputation ends tonight. James clenched his fists, his anger simmering. They think they've already won, he muttered. Not if we can stop them, Rebecca said, her tone fierce. Connor's computer dinged. Facial recognition match. The officers are part of Miller's unit. Send that to Thompson now, James said. We've got to stop this raid before it starts. Connor transferred the footage and ID matches to Thompson's team, and within moments, Thompson confirmed receipt. This is exactly what we needed, Thompson said. We'll confront them with the evidence as soon as they make their move. Stand by. At the community center, tension was palpable as the SWAT team gathered outside. Families inside the center huddled together, unaware of the storm about to descend. FBI agents positioned themselves discreetly, waiting for the moment to intervene. Through the live feed, James watched as the SWAT team leader barked orders. Breach on my count. 3-2. Hold your position. Thompson's voice rang out, cutting through the chaos. The SWAT team froze as Thompson and his agent stepped forward, badges raised. This operation is suspended, Thompson declared. We have evidence that this raid is based on planted materials and fabricated reports. The SWAT leader hesitated, glancing at his men. This is a sanctioned operation. Stand down, or you'll be interfering with a criminal conspiracy, Thompson interrupted, holding up a tablet displaying the footage of the officers planting evidence. Unless you'd like to explain why your team is executing a raid based on falsified evidence? The SWAT leader's face darkened. I don't take orders from the FBI. You will now, Thompson said, his tone ice-cold. Because if you don't, you'll be complicit in this corruption. A murmur rippled through the SWAT team as some of the officers lowered their weapons. The leader's authority was crumbling under the weight of the exposed truth. Back at the command center, James and his team watched in tense silence. The intercepted radio chatter grew chaotic as conspirators realized their operation had been compromised. What's happening? Rebecca asked, her voice tight. They're panicking, James said. And panicked people make mistakes. Connor suddenly gasped. They're clearing their comms. Trying to erase their tracks. Can you stop them? James asked urgently. I'm trying, Connor replied, his hands a blur on the keyboard. If I can save the data before it's wiped, we'll have even more evidence. The screen flickered as Connor fought against the data purge. Bit by bit, he salvaged fragments of incriminating messages, enough to add to their growing case. Meanwhile, the scene at the community center was reaching a boiling point. Thompson's agents moved swiftly, detaining the officers involved in the raid. Miller was among them, his face twisted in fury as he was placed in handcuffs. You think this changes anything? Miller sneered. You can't stop what's coming. Maybe not, Thompson said, his voice calm. But we can stop you. As Miller was led away, Thompson radioed back to James. We've secured the scene. No casualties, and we've recovered the planted evidence. Your community center is safe. James exhaled, relief flooding through him. Thank you, Agent Thompson. This is just the beginning. That night, James and his team reviewed the fallout from the day's events. News of the foiled raid spread rapidly, with headlines shifting from scandal to triumph. The footage of the conspirators' meeting, paired with the evidence from the raid, left no doubt about the corruption within the department. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, exhaustion etched on her face. We did it, James. We stopped them. James nodded, though his expression remained somber. We stopped this operation, but the fight isn't over. Grayson and his backers are still out there. Until they're brought to justice, this isn't over. Connor spoke up. I've been digging into the encrypted files we recovered earlier. There's a name that keeps coming up, Project Pinnacle. It's vague, but it might be connected to Grayson's broader network. Find out everything you can, James said. If this is their next move, we need to be ready. As the team disbanded for the night, James stood alone in the command center, staring at the screens filled with evidence, headlines, and the faces of those who had conspired against him. The fight ahead was daunting, but he was more determined than ever. The conspirators had underestimated him once. They wouldn't make that mistake again. James sat at his desk, the early morning light filtering through the blinds. The events of the previous night had shifted the tide, but the battle wasn't over. The name Project Pinnacle lingered in his mind like an unanswered question. It was clear that Miller and his conspirators were part of something far larger, something that extended beyond the local police department. Rebecca walked in, carrying a fresh cup of coffee. She set it on the desk and pulled up a chair, her face a mix of exhaustion and determination. "Connor's been working on Project Pinnacle all night," she said. "He thinks it's not just a local operation. It's national." James leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "National? How far does this go?" Rebecca handed him a tablet with Connor's findings. The data revealed connections between Grayson's shell companies and other police departments across the country. Payments labeled as training expenses and consulting fees flowed through multiple accounts, each tied to officers or officials pushing back against reform. "This isn't just about targeting you," Rebecca continued. "It's about maintaining a system. They're funding opposition to reform nationwide, using fear and intimidation to keep people silent." James's jaw tightened. "And they're using people like Miller to do their dirty work. If we can expose this network, we can bring the entire system down." Rebecca nodded. Connors identified a potential lead. Grayson is scheduled to attend a private event in Chicago this weekend, an exclusive fundraiser with key political and corporate players. It's the kind of place where people like him feel untouchable. James's eyes narrowed. If he's there, he'll let his guard down. We might be able to gather intel directly from him, or at least figure out who's backing him. Rebecca hesitated. "It's risky, James. Grayson is dangerous, and his people are on high alert. If they suspect anything, it could go south fast." James stood, his decision made. "We don't have a choice. If we don't act now, they'll regroup and come back stronger. I'll go to Chicago." Rebecca looked startled. "You? James, you're too high profile. If anyone recognizes you—" "I'll go undercover," James interrupted. "I've handled dangerous situations before. And if Grayson's going to let something slip, I want to hear it firsthand." Rebecca sighed, clearly reluctant. "Then we'll need a solid cover story and someone to go with you. Connor can run comms from here, but you'll need someone on the ground." "I'll take Bradley," James said. "He knows how these people operate, and after everything he's risked, I trust him." Rebecca gave a slow nod. "I'll make the arrangements." 2 days later, James and Bradley boarded a small, nondescript plane to Chicago. Bradley had been quiet since the raid, the weight of his family's endangerment and his role in the conspiracy hanging heavily on him. "You don't have to do this," James said as the plane ascended. "You've already done more than enough." Bradley shook his head. "I need to see this through. For my family, and for everyone who's been hurt by people like Miller." James respected the resolve in Bradley's voice. Despite his fear, the man was committed to making things right. The fundraiser was held in a sprawling modern estate on the outskirts of Chicago. The guest list read like a who's who of political and corporate elite, all dressed in designer suits and cocktail dresses. James, wearing a tailored tuxedo and using the alias Michael Latham, moved through the crowd with practiced ease. Bradley, dressed similarly, stayed close, his eyes scanning the room. "Grayson's over there," he whispered, nodding toward a corner where Grayson stood with a group of men, a glass of whiskey in hand. James glanced over, careful not to draw attention. "Let's move closer. Listen, but don't engage." They positioned themselves near Grayson, pretending to examine a piece of abstract art on the wall. Grayson's voice carried over the din of the party, low and confident. "Lawson's little stunt won't last," Grayson was saying, his words dripping with disdain. "We've dealt with bigger threats before. The key is staying coordinated. Pinnacle ensures we stay ahead of these reformist idiots." One of the men with Grayson chuckled. "And if Lawson gets too bold?" Grayson smirked. "Then we remind him who's really in charge." Bradley's jaw tightened, but James placed a calming hand on his shoulder. "Not yet," his gesture said. As the conversation continued, James discreetly activated a recording device hidden in his cufflink. Every word Grayson spoke was another thread to pull on, a piece of the puzzle connecting Project Pinnacle to its broader network. But then, the unexpected happened. Grayson's eyes swept the room and locked onto James. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Excuse me," Grayson said to his group, stepping toward James. Bradley tensed. "He's coming." "Stay calm," James said, turning just as Grayson approached. "I don't believe we've met," Grayson said, extending a hand. "Alexander Grayson." "Michael Latham," James replied smoothly, shaking his hand. "It's a pleasure." Grayson's eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to place James. You seem familiar. Have we crossed paths before? James smiled, keeping his voice steady. Not that I'm aware of. I travel frequently, though. Perhaps in passing. Grayson studied him for a moment longer, then smiled faintly. Well, enjoy the evening, Mr. Latham. These events can be enlightening. As Grayson walked away, James exhaled silently. Bradley leaned in. That was close. Too close, James muttered. We've got what we need. Let's get out of here before he starts asking questions. Back at their hotel, James and Bradley reviewed the recording. Grayson's arrogance had been his downfall. His casual mention of Project Pinnacle and the assurance that it would stay ahead was damning. We need to get this to Thompson, James said. This proves Grayson's connection to the conspiracy. With this and the financial data, we can bring charges against him and his backers. Bradley nodded, but his expression was troubled. Grayson's not going to take this lying down. He knows you're coming for him. James leaned back in his chair, his eyes steely. Let him prepare. We've faced everything he's thrown at us so far. This time, we're bringing him down for good. The recording of Grayson's conversation became the linchpin for James's case. Back in their home state, James's team worked alongside the FBI to connect the dots. Each revelation painted a more damning picture of Project Pinnacle, a nationwide effort to suppress reform and preserve the status quo through corruption, intimidation, and outright criminal activity. As they compiled their evidence, Rebecca briefed James on the growing public support following his earlier revelations. People are rallying behind you, she said, scrolling through social media feeds. Community leaders, reform advocates, even some police officers. The tide is turning. James nodded, but his focus was on the battle ahead. Grayson and his backers won't go quietly. We need to act decisively before they can regroup. The FBI began drafting arrest warrants for Grayson, Miller, and key conspirators identified through financial and surveillance records. The plan was to execute simultaneous raids across multiple states, dismantling Project Pinnacle in one fell swoop. But Grayson wasn't sitting idly by. Late one evening, James received an anonymous message on his secure phone. It was a video file. Hesitant but curious, he played it. The footage showed a dimly lit room where a man sat tied to a chair, bruised and bleeding. The camera zoomed in on the man's face. It was Bradley. A distorted voice accompanied the image. You've been a thorn in our side, Lawson. If you want him back alive, you'll cease your investigation immediately. James's chest tightened. He immediately called Rebecca and Agent Thompson to the office. They've got Bradley, James said, showing them the video. And they're using him to try to shut us down. Thompson's expression darkened. This confirms how desperate they've become. They know we're closing in. Rebecca frowned. We can't let them get away with this. Do we have any way to trace the video? Connor, already at his laptop, began analyzing the file. The metadata's been scrubbed, but there's a faint audio echo. Could be the acoustics of the room. Give me a few minutes. Minutes felt like hours as Connor worked. Finally, he snapped his fingers. Got it. There's a factory about 20 miles outside the city that matches the audio profile. It's been abandoned for years. James stood immediately. Then that's where we're going. Thompson held up a hand. Wait. We'll handle this. It's too dangerous for you to be directly involved. With all due respect, Agent Thompson, James said, his voice steely, Bradley's in this mess because he trusted me. I'm not sitting on the sidelines. Thompson studied James for a moment, then nodded. Fine. But you follow my lead. The factory loomed in the distance, its broken windows glinting under the moonlight. FBI agents surrounded the building, armed and ready. James stood with Thompson, a bulletproof vest under his coat. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Bradley sat slumped in the chair, his breathing shallow. Miller stood nearby, his gun resting lazily in his hand. Grayson paced the room, his face tight with frustration. This wasn't part of the plan, Miller growled. We're drawing too much attention. Grayson shot him a glare. Lawson left us no choice. Desperate times call for desperate measures. Before they could argue further, a sharp crack echoed through the factory as the FBI breached the doors. Chaos erupted. Agents flooded the room, shouting commands. Miller raised his weapon, but an agent fired first, disarming him. Grayson tried to flee, but James stepped into his path, blocking the exit. It's over, Grayson, James said, his voice cold. You've run out of places to hide. Grayson sneered. You think you've won? This is bigger than you, bigger than me. You take me down, and someone else will take my place. Then we'll take them down too, James replied. One by one. As agents cuffed Grayson, Thompson and James rushed to Bradley's side. He was battered but conscious, his eyes filled with relief as he saw James. I knew you'd come, Bradley whispered. James placed a hand on his shoulder. You're safe now. Let's get you out of here. The takedown of Grayson and his network sent shockwaves across the country. Headlines declared it a major victory against systemic corruption. The footage of Bradley's rescue, paired with the evidence from the raids, cemented the public's trust in James's efforts. In the days that followed, James stood before a crowd of supporters, addressing the nation once again. This is not the end, he said, his voice strong. It's the beginning of a new era, one where justice isn't a privilege but a right for everyone. We've proven that no one is above the law. Now we must continue the fight to ensure that the systems meant to protect us serve all of us equally. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. Back at his office, James sat with Rebecca and his team, a rare moment of quiet settling over them. You did it, Rebecca said, her smile genuine. You brought them down. James nodded, though his expression was thoughtful. We did it. But the work isn't finished. There's still so much to rebuild. Connor grinned. Then I guess we'd better get started. As James leaned back, the weight of the past weeks lifted slightly from his shoulders. He knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time he felt hope, a belief that change was not only possible but inevitable. And this time, he wasn't fighting alone. The morning after the takedown of Grayson and his network, James awoke to a flood of messages from across the country. Activists, politicians, and ordinary citizens expressed their gratitude and pledged their support. The momentum was palpable, but James knew that victories like these could be fleeting if not sustained. Rebecca entered his office with a steaming mug of coffee and a stack of papers. Morning, James. You've got interviews lined up, meetings with civil rights groups, and the governor wants a briefing on the aftermath of the raids. James took the coffee with a tired smile. No rest for the wicked, or the reformers. Rebecca laughed lightly, but her expression quickly grew serious. There's something else. Connor found additional files on Grayson's encrypted drive. It's bigger than we thought. James set his coffee down. How much bigger? Rebecca handed him a tablet. There's evidence of lobbying groups funding efforts similar to Project Pinnacle in other states. Grayson wasn't the top of the chain, he was just a regional player. The real masterminds are still out there. James scrolled through the data, his brow furrowing. The names listed were prominent and powerful. CEOs, high-ranking officials, even members of Congress. These were individuals who wielded enormous influence and had worked tirelessly to shield themselves from accountability. If we go after them, James said slowly, it'll make everything we've faced so far look like a warm-up. Rebecca nodded. But if we don't, they'll rebuild. The system will reset itself, and everything we've achieved will be undone. James stared at the screen, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He knew the stakes. Taking on individuals this powerful would require not only evidence but unwavering public support. We're not stopping, James said finally. If we've come this far, we're going all the way. Over the next few weeks, James's team worked tirelessly to analyze the new data. The revelations were staggering: secret meetings, dark money campaigns, and covert operations aimed at undermining reform efforts across the nation. Every piece of evidence strengthened their case, but it also painted a chilling picture of the lengths these groups were willing to go to maintain control. Bradley, now fully recovered, became an integral part of the team. His first-hand knowledge of the conspirators' methods provided invaluable insight. These people think they're invincible, Bradley said during a strategy meeting. They've spent years building this system, convincing themselves it can't be dismantled. That's their weakness. Connor grinned. And our advantage. They've left a trail of arrogance a mile wide. We just have to follow it. James smiled at the camaraderie in the room. Despite the odds, his team was united, their determination unshakable. One of the most critical pieces of evidence pointed to an upcoming summit in Washington, D.C., where several of the key figures from the files would be gathering. Ostensibly, it was a conference on national security, but James and his team knew better. This is where we make our move, James said during a briefing. We'll work with the FBI to ensure every angle is covered. surveillance, undercover agents, and a media strategy to release the evidence publicly as soon as arrests are made. Agent Thompson, now fully invested in the case, nodded. We'll coordinate simultaneous operations across multiple states. When the summit ends, they'll have nowhere to hide. The day of the summit arrived, and tension crackled in the air. James and his team monitored the operation from a secure location, their screens displaying live feeds from the conference venue and other targeted locations. The FBI agents moved with precision, apprehending individuals as they left the summit. Grayson's higher-ups, unaware of the net closing around them, continued their discussions inside, oblivious to the fact that their time was running out. Finally, it was time for the main arrests. As the doors to the conference room burst open, agents flooded in, reading charges and handcuffing stunned attendees. The media, tipped off by James's team, captured every moment, broadcasting it live. The fallout was immediate and massive. Headlines across the country proclaimed the dismantling of a nationwide corruption network. Public outrage turned into action, with calls for deeper investigations and widespread reforms. James became a symbol of resilience and accountability, his name synonymous with the fight for justice. But he remained focused on the work ahead, knowing that systemic change required more than one victory. A month later, James stood on the steps of the Capitol, addressing a crowd of thousands. Beside him were Rebecca, Bradley, Connor, and others who had been instrumental in the fight. "We have proven that no one is above the law," James said, his voice carrying across the sea of people. "But the work doesn't end here. This is not just about taking down the corrupt, it's about building a system that serves everyone equally and fairly. Together, we can create a future where justice is not a privilege but a promise." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing in unity. James stepped back, his heart swelling with hope. For the first time in years, he felt the tide turning, not just for him, but for the nation. The fight wasn't over, but the momentum was unstoppable. And this time, they weren't just fighting against something, they were fighting for something worth believing in. Months passed, and the ripple effects of James Lawson's work continued to shape the nation. The arrests of the conspirators not only dismantled Project Pinnacle, but also ignited a wave of accountability across the country. Police departments, political offices, and corporate entities faced renewed scrutiny, forcing long overdue reforms. James had become a household name, but he remained focused on the mission. His office was inundated with messages of gratitude and requests for guidance from other states eager to follow his lead. Despite the growing spotlight, James remained grounded, driven by a simple truth: justice was not an endpoint but a continuous effort. One crisp morning, James walked into his office, where Rebecca, Bradley, and Connor were waiting. The room was quiet, a rare moment of calm after months of relentless work. "We've just received word," Rebecca said, handing him a document. "The federal investigation has concluded. Grayson and his backers are facing charges ranging from conspiracy to money laundering." "It's over, James." James read the document, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like years. "This is a victory," he said, his voice steady. "But we know the fight doesn't end here. There are still people who need our help, systems that need fixing." Bradley nodded. "And we'll keep going. You've shown us what's possible." Connor smirked. "Not to mention, we've become pretty good at taking down bad guys." The room filled with quiet laughter, a moment of levity after the intense battles they had faced together. Later that day, James attended a community event at the center he had helped protect during the height of the conspiracy. Families filled the space, sharing stories, playing games, and engaging in workshops. The once tense atmosphere had been replaced with hope. As James moved through the crowd, a young boy approached him, clutching a notebook. "Mr. Lawson, can I get your autograph?" James smiled, crouching to meet the boy's gaze. "Of course. What's your name?" "Elijah," the boy said shyly. "I want to be like you when I grow up. My mom says you're a hero." James's heart swelled. He signed the notebook, adding a short note of encouragement. "Elijah, you can be anything you want to be. And the best way to be a hero is to help others. Always remember that." Elijah beamed and ran off to show his friends. That evening, James returned home, the sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He stood on his balcony, gazing out at the city he had fought so hard to protect. The weight of the battles he had faced lingered, but so did the hope of what lay ahead. Rebecca joined him, holding 2 glasses of iced tea. She handed him one, and they stood in comfortable silence for a moment. "You've done something incredible, James," Rebecca said finally. "You've changed lives, inspired people. How does it feel?" James took a sip of his tea, a small smile playing on his lips. "It feels like a beginning. There's still so much work to do, but for the first time, I feel like we're moving in the right direction." Rebecca nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "You've proven that change is possible, even when the odds are stacked against us." James looked at her, his expression resolute. "Because it's not just about me. It's about all of us, working together, refusing to give up. That's how we win." As the stars began to dot the sky, James felt a profound sense of peace. The road ahead would still have challenges, but he was no longer alone in the fight. The people, the movement, and the nation were with him. And together, they were unstoppable.